I'm here with Jon Sisk, who's fresh off a quite nice build of a Van's RV14. That's Jon's RV14 you see in his virtual background there, called White Lightning. This airplane recently being used to test GAMI's G100UL high-octane new avgas. A little bit of history on this good-looking RV14 for the audience.
Well, my background has been almost entirely in certified aircraft for the last 40 years or so. Everything, singles, twin Cessnas, and 4 PA-46s, piston and turbine. And but I've always had wanted to do an experimental amateur-built airplane, but I still work full-time, and so that's been difficult. But a few years ago, I decided to make it happen, and so started with a partner on this RV14 build. And part of my background was in STC development. So one of the things I really like about the experimental world is the ability to, make changes and do things exactly, the way that you want. And finish this airplane up, at least, ready for licensing and beginning the flight test in May of 2022. Sort of combine that with, I've been involved one way or another in the unleaded avgas development since about 2010. And when I saw that GAMI had gotten a high octane unleaded fuel FAA approved, I decided to go ahead and include that on the limitations of the aircraft. One of the beautiful things with the experimental amateur built certification is, it's up to the manufacturer, or in this case, the builder is considered the manufacturer. And it's up to the builder to establish the limitations for the aircraft, and that includes fuel. And since GAMI's, fuel had was in the process of STC approval, I contacted them and basically got their permission to use their approved data and go ahead and list the limitations on my aircraft to include any 100 octane, commercial fuel. So not just 100 low lead. And then I specifically called out G100UL, which is the GAMI fuel, in the limitations section, because it's already approved. And that became part of the POH and everything that I submitted for inspection when the aircraft was, undergoing licensing. So it really became real simple. First, experimental aircraft don't need an STC because they don't have a type certificate. There's nothing to modify or supplement. So it's actually a pretty straightforward process to do this. And if there are, other approved high octane, 100 octane fuels that come out, then it's already approved under the limitations to go ahead and be able to use those. You asked about the White Lightning thing. Our company has been in the business for about 20 years of manufacturing ground power units. All of our devices come in a white box, and they make power, and that's how the whole White Lightning thing got to be. And our experimental airplane is now sort of our mascot, if you will.
The RV14 has got a 215 horsepower Lycoming YIO 390 EXP. How did you expect this engine to run on a G100UL fuel?
Well, this engine is a little higher than normal compression ratio. It's getting close to 9-to-1, so it's actually a good test candidate for doing something like this. But the FAA approved G100UL for every engine in their database, type certificate database. So I wasn't really expecting a problem, but at the same time, it needs to be tested and tried out. So I thought, this airplane would be a good test for, normal operation of
Yeah.
a new fuel.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about the process. You actually flew over to GAMI's headquarters in Oklahoma, and
Right.
how did you go about the flight test? How much fuel did you add to the airplane, and did you separate it by tank, or what was your process?
So flew down to Ada, Oklahoma, to visit with them, and made it clear what we wanted to do. And anyway, once we got there, then uh, essentially moved all of the remaining fuel that was in the right tank over to the left, so that we'd have 100 low lead on the left tank, and then we filled the right tank with the G100UL. And so that set up the ability to test the two fuels against each other in a simple manner, just by switching from left to right. And there's a little delay in doing that with, fuel that's already in the lines between the fuel selector and the engine. But it's an easy way to do it. And of course, the test periods for doing this sort of thing, it's not a few seconds. It's a significant period of time, like,
Yeah.
several minutes.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about your test regime. What are you accustomed to seeing out of this engine as far as temperatures and speeds and burn and all that at whatever altitude it is you tested at? Can you make a side-by-side comparison of what you saw?
Yeah, I mean, the things I wanted to test were, as much as I could make it, more both the extremes of operation and what I consider, just normal sustained operation. So we started out, by taking off on the right tank with the G100UL fuel, and we did, of course, full power takeoff, and then also came back around for a full power low pass to document the event and get some photography there still at Ada, Oklahoma. And then once we'd done that, then it was we wanted to do a full power climb up to altitude. In this case, it's normally aspirated airplane, so we were climbing to 10,500 feet. Nice VFR day, and wanted to get up to altitude for cruising. So anyway, kept the airplane at wide open throttle all the way through the climb. Did not see anything unusual in terms of temperatures, operation, anything like that. Of course, what we expected based on what the FAA has said. They've done all the testing for material compatibility and detonation, and the various characteristics of the fuel. So we weren't really expecting any surprises. But on the other hand, there's nothing like proving it to yourself. So
Yeah.
anyway, we did the sustained climb up to 10,500 feet. And at that altitude with this engine installation, not to brag on myself, but the engine's well cooled. And we set it up for, it's still wide open throttle in cruise because, of course, you got, fewer air molecules up there to work with. But the airplane will make 65% power at that altitude with no boost or anything. And so at any rate, in the cruise configuration, then I typically lean pretty aggressively with this engine. It seems to like running at peak EGT, which is in the mid 1400s on average. And we've worked with the fuel servo manufacturer. In this case, it's Airflow Performance that makes the fuel system. And we've worked with them to get the nozzles all balanced out to where as you're pulling the mixture control back, all of the cylinders reach their peak temperature, not necessarily the same temperature, but they reach their peak temperature at the same point on the mixture pull. And that makes this engine still run pretty powerfully at peak EGT and nice and smooth. And you've seen from the screenshots and things we've published, that puts the EGTs in the mid 1400s, and our cylinder temperatures in the mid 300s. So didn't really see anything unusual there. Oil temperature about what we expected, and we left it there in cruise for probably half an hour just to make sure things are completely settled out, and getting accurate measurements. This airplane's equipped with the Garmin G3X flight deck, and so it's taking a snapshot of all of the engine parameters every second, and produces these massive spreadsheets if you care to download those and start digging through it. But an abundance of flight data, so everything we need, plus the screenshots and notes that we took during the flight. We had several opportunities then to switch back and forth between go from the unleaded fuel that we're testing to the 100 low lead that just came from the pump. And the difference, what I would say is that the differences that are perceivable to the pilot aren't. You wouldn't know that you had changed from one fuel to the other at all. In digging through the flight data and carefully watching the temperatures and things like that, we were looking for any change in airspeed, temperatures, things like that, and really could not. If there was a difference in the engine output and as measured by airspeed, it's within the margin of error. About the time you'd think you'd see a knot or two, it would go the other direction. It's, you're talking about, like I say, a knot or two, so it's within the margin of error.
Yep.
The GAMI fuel is slightly heavier. It's like 6 pounds per gallon versus slightly less for 100 low lead, maybe 5.85. It has an offsetting density of a little more energy, more BTUs per gallon than Avgas. In an operational sense, it doesn't seem to make any difference. The only thing I could even measure was about a 10-degree difference in the exhaust gas temperature. And so here we're talking about with the unleaded fuel, say 1440 on the highest EGT, and when it would settle out on 100 low lead, maybe 1430. I did try it at another altitude. We descended to 8,500 as we got closer to Lexington, just to pick another baseline, and did all the same tests again. Saw exactly the same thing. The engine, the difference in the engine makes a little more power going down 2,000 feet, but that's not significant. Retuned the mixture to make sure we were still at peak EGT, and basically saw exactly the same thing. Couldn't measure an airspeed difference, couldn't feel anything or hear anything, and a very, very slight difference in the EGT of maybe 10 degrees.
What's the fuel capacity of the 14?
It carries 50 gallons, and we're burning in cruise. We're burning 9.5 gallons consistently. So it's got a good, and it's also it cruises at 200 miles an hour, 170 to 175 knots at 65%. So it's a pretty efficient airplane.
Yeah,
and that gives you a good 4 hours with reasonable reserves if you're doing that.
Yeah. In the certified world, if you buy the STC for the G100UL, you get a placard kit. You get documentation, but you also get a placard kit to put around the. Well,
I'm trying to. Here we go.
There it is. Yeah.
There's
Same thing for when you add it to the op specs of an experimental airplane. Where does that go? Around the fuel filler?
Yeah, you just it joins the fuel filler somewhere, and it references STC numbers and stuff like that. For the experimental world, I guess in my case, GAMI wanted to document this, and they put the placard on that right tank so there wouldn't be any confusion. And
Yeah.
then they gave me one, and for the actual in-flight photography, as opposed to screenshots, I actually held it up next to the G3X display, so it'd be clear that which fuel we were burning,
Yeah.
at the time. But for for the experimental builder, you can put your own placards on there. It doesn't necessarily have to come from GAMI, because you don't need to reference an STC. And if the airplane had already been finished, the process then would be similar, but a little different in that, the builder can do minor alterations. If you've got something that in the certified world would be considered a major alteration, which you can argue that a change in fuel is a major alteration, then you would need to put the builder would need to put the airplane back into phase one, which has your restricted operating area, and then do the necessary testing to determine that alteration doesn't have any adverse consequences, and then amend their pilot's operating handbook once that's all completed. So it's a little different. In my case, we did it on the front end with the initial FAA licensing, and then went through phase one, and then of course, and now obviously running the unleaded fuel without any issues at all. Another thing I would point out, also, I think I mentioned earlier, my placarding around the fuel filler caps, it says 100 octane avgas. So at the point that any of the other contestants in this unleaded fuel race have something that's approved, then I want to fly it and check it out for my airplane too. And wish them all the best. It just happens that GAMI is the only fuel out there today that is actually been through all the testing and is FAA approved. And of course, they're waiting to, not waiting is the wrong word, but they're establishing the infrastructure and all is necessary to commercialize it and get it to where it can be delivered to the FBO pumps. FBOs are not going to install, or I don't think they're going to install additional tanks to have multiple grades of avgas. It's not going to be like what you have at the auto pump.
Yeah. Well, it's worth mentioning that the G100UL is it's intermixable, an appropriate term. So
they call it fungible.
Fungible
which was a new word to me.
Yeah. Yeah. So you isolated the fuel from each tank, but you could pump it in either tank and mix it, and then same thing on a fuel farm. You could mix it in, and
we actually did that. I made a point on this. The trip from Ada to Lexington is 600 plus nautical miles, and I made a point of landing with as much of the unleaded fuel in my right tank as possible, which ended up being about 11 gallons. And so subsequent to that flight test between Oklahoma and Kentucky, I did another test locally where we added 10 gallons of 100 low lead back into the right tank. So I'd have about a 50-50 mix of 100 low lead and G100 with predictably the same results. The only thing, I did send some pictures back to GAMI just to show them examples of the fuel that I extracted, with a fuel tester, so you could see the color. The 100 low lead, has a blue dye in it, and the GAMI fuel has a light green dye. And what you end up with at a 50-50 mix is, almost like an amber. It's, sort of between the two.
Does it smell any different?
A little. It's recognizably different if you have in an A/B test, if you've got the two side by side. Not sure by itself, like, if a pilot would notice a whole lot.
Mm-hmm. Well, before we wrap up, you've been following this unleaded avgas discussion for a lot of years. What have you seen change from then to now as far as the discussion is concerned? You're very active in general aviation with a bunch of different airplanes. How has the discussion changed from then to now?
Well, I got involved in 2010. I was asked to serve on the FAA's rulemaking committee when, this was kind of starting, and representing owners of, from different type clubs for high performance aircraft that need a full octane fuel. And I would say that what hasn't changed is the political climate. Back then, you sort of had the government industry consensus groups that wanted everybody to kind of fall in line and do everything one way. And the people that were trying to pursue STCs were the outliers. And, it was kind of an us and them mentality. I think that still holds true. The Eagle group is a little better now because I think it's strongly influenced by AOPA and actual pilots and things like that. But I think I think the people, Swift and GAMI, that are pursuing their approvals by STC, still have to fight bureaucratically to get their place in all of this. So, that's what hasn't changed. What has changed very recently, is we've got the EPA endangerment finding now. It's been anticipated for a long time. And so we may build a head of steam based on environmental activism to, people quit dragging their feet. I get a lot of comments, emails, and people contacting me that want to know, is like, hey, we've got an approved fuel. Why can't we get going with this?
Yeah.
But there are a lot of parts and pieces to this, and I have to say I don't really understand all the politics of what's involved. If you follow the dollars, I think there's an economic incentive to continue selling 100 low lead. It's a relatively small volume fuel, but I think it's a highly profitable fuel. But in the future, having an unleaded fuel, whosever fuel it is, opens up all sorts of possibilities because the infrastructure will no longer be contaminated. Right now, if you've got rail cars and barges and things that are hauling leaded fuel, they can go one direction. They can't carry anything back because they're contaminated.
Yeah.
The same thing's true for refinery plants and things like that. Once we have a fuel that isn't contaminated, there should be a lot more refineries. The fuel should be made closer to where it's going to be used. And there's some economies that eventually should be realized from doing that. Plus, I think there's going to be economies of operation that's better for your engine to not be having lead deposits inside your engine.
You could look for a full report on Jon Sisk's flight test of G100UL in the December 2023 issue of Aviation Consumer magazine. Jon, thank you.
My pleasure.